We're going to begin Unit 3 now, and in Unit 3 we're going to focus on populations. In our first lecture we're going to look at population dynamics and apply the theories of population growth to natural populations. And then in the second lecture of Unit 3 we'll touch more on human population growth and its unique characteristics. In this first lecture we're going to take a look at what characterizes a population. We'll look at the different models of population growth, what limits population growth, a special focus on what carrying capacity is, and then we'll finish up by taking a look at different reproductive strategies. A population is defined as a group of individuals of the same species occupying a given area at a given time. So we've talked about that as one of the levels of ecological study, that we can study things at the population level. Population dynamics is how a population changes over time. And the two main factors that go into the dynamics of population change will be natality is one of them, which is basically the number of individuals that can be added to a population through reproduction. So really what we're looking at is the birth rate, and we often use the term birth rate when we're studying human populations. Mortality is the number of deaths, and in human populations we refer to that as the death rate. The population growth rate is the rate at which individuals are added to the population, and it's heavily dependent on both natality and mortality, or the birth rate and death rate. And in this illustration or diagram here, we can see how that affects population growth in human populations. So we look first at Costa Rica. We can see Costa Rica has a much higher birth rate than death rate in this example, and we can see that each year that adds to the population. You can see that it grows. In the United States, birth rate and death rate are quite similar, and so there's very moderate growth, almost stability. In the country Hungary, the death rate is actually much higher than the birth rate, and we can see that the population is declining. When we take a look at mortality, one of the key features that affects population growth is, well, when is mortality occurring during an organism's or a population's lifetime? And so we can graph this over what we call a survivorship curve, a graph that shows the proportion of individuals likely to survive at each age. And there's three types of survivorship curves. We're going to start with type 1, which is exemplified here by humans, that really survivorship is quite high and mortality rates don't really increase until we hit elderly ages, late in life. A type 2 survivorship curve is when the survivorship and mortality chances are pretty much the same throughout the entire course of the organism's life. And then type 3 is when the organism is least likely to survive when it's young. And actually, if it does grow to an adult stage, such as this large tree, it tends to live for quite a long time. Let's look at some specific examples. Again, type 1, individuals are likely to survive to an old age. So this ram population that we can see here, you can see that the survivorship is quite high until they reach a certain age, and then mortality kind of kicks in. In type 2, we can see this bird population. Whether they're an egg or a chick or an adult bird, it doesn't really matter. That doesn't seem to influence the mortality rate or the survivability. It's pretty much uniform throughout their entire life course. And then, as is very common with plants, many seeds don't survive to adulthood. They don't take root, so mortality or survivorship is very low during that stage. But if the plant finds adequate soil and a place to grow, it tends to survive for quite a while. Population density is basically looking at how organisms are dispersed, or how close together they are organized in a unit area. Dispersal is how they're moving about, and basically looking at how the pattern of of movement among the population and how dense it is as well. So we, of course, when we have dispersal, we can have emigration, which would be movement out of a particular area, and immigration is movement into an area. In human populations, we often see that people are emigrating from populations or countries, as we like to call them, that are experiencing hardship, whether it be due to political strife or hard economics. Even we're seeing a lot of people emigrate because of climate change, and immigrating to countries that are have more stable political structures or economics. And so, but the same thing happens in natural populations. We will see that organisms will disperse or migrate where conditions are better. And so we can see that even in natural populations. So population dispersion basically has three types, three patterns. We can say a very common thing in herding animals is clumps, like these elks here, which of course stay in herds that offer them protection from predators, also some social reinforcement and mating opportunities. Flowers and seeds are often dispersed randomly wherever winds or pollinators distribute them, and so they just kind of go randomly. And occasionally we do see some uniform distribution, like these creosote bushes here in the desert that are basically trying to maximize their ability to acquire this scarce water in their environment. Plus, they also release toxins into the soil that tend to prevent other bushes from growing close. So as a result, they tend to distribute themselves quite uniformly throughout the habitat. Let's now take a look at the two general models for how populations grow. And we'll first take a look at the basics, exponential growth. So population change, or the growth rate R, and the little r here is an important little variable when we talk about population growth. This is basically the percent or rate at which the population is growing. And it's calculated quite simply by taking the births and immigrations, because these are both things that add to a population, right? So we put those together and we subtract the deaths and emigration. These are the things that would take away from a population. And so that can give us a growth rate R. So so R is very significant when we're talking about population growth. Now, this model of exponential growth assumes that R, or the population growth rate, will not change and is constant. And so when R is quite high, we say the population is growing at a very high potential very quickly, and it often gives us a J curve. So exponential growth is usually graphed like this. The curve is shaped like a J. Now, let's just say, and this would be when the birth rate is quite high and the death rate is quite low, you're going to have high population growth. But let's say the birth rate declines or the death rate goes up, then R may not be as high, like the value for the population growth rate. Well, it's still going to grow exponentially, but just not at the same rate, so the curve kind of flattens out. Now, what would happen if birth rates and death rates and emigration are equal, right? Well, then population growth rate R would be 0, and that would flatline the growth, right? There would be no growth at all. And the last condition is, well, what if death rate and emigration are greater than birth and immigration? Well, then the R would be negative, and that would cause the population to decline. So again, exponential growth model is not something really seen in nature, although we do see it sometimes in bacteria populations that are causing an infection in a human, for example. They will grow at their full biotic potential very, very quickly and cause the infection. And that's exponential growth at a very high and constant rate until you apply an antibiotic to stop the growth of that bacteria population. In reality, what we often see is what's called logistic growth. And logistic growth looks like this. So it has the characteristics of exponential growth, but often we see what's called an S curve. The reason this happens is because R tends to not, or the population growth rate is typically not constant and changes due to environmental resistance. At some point, there will be the full biotic potential in which the population is growing at its full speed, its full highest rate, and it is growing exponentially. But eventually, and we've talked about this in previous labs and case studies, a carrying capacity will kick in and limit the population's growth. And so this is more typical of populations in the wild. And when we look at this logistic growth, we can see there's characteristics of this S-shaped curve. Initially, the population grows slowly. There's a lag phase. And we saw this with a previous lab when we were looking at the growth, the predator-prey lab, when we were watching the growth of owl populations as they were trying to um, acquire and hunt for the mice in the population. But there was a lag. There was a slow growth at first, really in both populations. But eventually you reached a point where the populations were growing quite quickly. And this is known as the exponential growth phase, where the population is growing at an ever increasing rate. And this is where we have reached the full biotic potential. The full biotic potential is the maximum reproductive capacity of the population. Sometimes we refer to this as R sub max, right? It's growing really quick. This is an important value for when we talk about resource use late in a later lecture. We'll talk about how, like fisheries managers, for example, they want fish populations to grow quickly, and so often their target is to be able to have commercial fisheries collect fish from the wild down until the population is at such a level that it's still within its full biotic potential to reproduce. If you take too many fish, well, then you might push them back into the lag phase and they won't replenish the population quickly enough. More on that later, but it's just an interesting concept to review. Now, the deceleration phase is where now the population begins to decline, or at least the population increase is declining. Still growing very slowly, but now there's some pressures or resistance to its growth. The stable equilibrium phase is where the death rate and birth rate are equal, and R now is equaling 0. Things have flatlined, and of course we've established a carrying capacity for that particular population. So a lot of this carrying capacity and this resistance is set by what we call limiting factors, the conditions that basically determine what is the successful population size, when an organism can successfully reproduce, or a population I should say. And there's generally two types of limiting factors that we'll see. We'll see density dependent factors. These are factors that limit population growth or become more of a limiter on population size as the population grows. So for example, we can see in the first example given for us here is competition, right? We're seeing mule deer are competing for food, and there are actually some the competing mule deer competing with elk, right? So a little competition between species, right? We call that interspecific competition, right? So basically there's a greater competition for food, could be also for water, and that can limit both populations. Here, disease is said to be a density-dependent limiting factor because it's affecting larger populations. So the transmission of diseases, such as this chronic wasting disease that you'll see here, will spread more easily in larger populations because the herd is bigger and easier to transport the pathogen and transfer, I should say. And we kind of saw this with COVID a few years ago. Unfortunately, it was the major cities where population density of humans was very high, and it was easy to spread that virus. And so we saw our major cities throughout the world hit most heavily by the COVID virus. Now, density-independent limiting factors are not really affected by population size. So a forest fire is going to affect a small forest or a large forest. It really is kind of indiscriminate. Storms, hurricanes, etc., floods will affect large areas, large population densities, and small population densities. So it's kind of uniformly has a uniform effect on all populations, despite what their size is. So these limiting factors altogether will create what we call environmental resistance. And we can see here in this diagram, we've got our logistic growth here, right? We've got this lag, this exponential growth phase, and then we've reached a carrying capacity. And what sets the carrying capacity is the environmental resistance. In this case, for this fish population, we can see the available of dissolved oxygen in the water, the ability of food, or availability of food, I should say, prevalence of disease and predators, and also space. All of these contribute to establishing a cap to that population's size. So that's what we call the carrying capacity. We can see this illustrated. This data here is taken from Yellowstone National Park. Wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park in 1995. So we can see some packs were released. We're starting out with 20 wolves, and you can see they were reproducing very, very quickly. In fact, they continued to reproduce very, very quickly for almost 10 years. And then there was some declines and spikes, and then kind of leveled out right at about 100 wolves in the park. And so we can say from our evaluation that it appears that the carrying capacity of the wolves in Yellowstone is around 100 wolves. There's a little overshoot. We'll talk about what that is later, right? And this really is because there's so many elk. When they removed wolves from Yellowstone, early part of the 1900s, the elk population exploded, right? A trophic cascade, as we've talked about before. And so there are plenty of elk, and that allowed the wolf population to almost overpopulate. But then as elk become scarce, because the wolves were now controlling their levels, you can see the predator kind of followed that path to leveling out at about 100 wolves currently. Now, let's go ahead and talk about reproductive strategies, because these are the things that add to populations. And there's two important strategies we can, and the letters are interesting. Hopefully you recognize the letters. The first is the K strategist. K strategists are large organisms that basically live a long time. And these populations, these strategists typically have populations that stabilize at the carrying capacity. I don't know if you noticed, I failed to highlight this for you, but the carrying capacity is usually symbolized by the letter K in any kind of equation. So, and it's a capital K. So that's why we call them K strategists or K selected species. Now, K selected species basically have these 8 characteristics. They tend to live a long life. They grow slowly. They have late maturity, meaning it may take several years for them to reach reproductive ages. They tend to have a few and large offspring with a lot of parental care, and they're adapted for stable environments. They tend to be predators, and they need specific habitats. So K-selected species would be like bears and elk, and even some large, long-lived tree species are like that. Now, the other strategist is called an R strategist. Now, that's not a typo. It is important that R strategists are given a lowercase r. That's very important, because these organisms don't really stabilize at a carrying capacity. What they're trying to do is maximize their population growth rate, or R, and that's why they're given this designation as R selected. They have a short life, rapid growth, early maturity, many offspring, very little parental care, tend to have unstable environments, are usually low in the food chain and are prey, and can use a number of different habitats. So we can see dandelions, deer mice, knapweed are given an example here. Bait fish in the ocean like anchovies are another great example. They don't live very long, they're kind of small, but when they reproduce, they'll have thousands, if not millions, of eggs at a breeding season, and the population just explodes, and you have this huge bait ball or school of fish that attracts predators, and then they're all consumed, but the survivors will reproduce again, and so they go through these cycles. So if we were to look at the population growth curve of these two, we'll start out with a K-selected species. Notice that a K-selected species has that typical S-shaped curve. There's a little fluctuation, kind of like what we saw in the wolves, right, in Yellowstone, but eventually they stabilize right around the carrying capacity. R selected species, like the anchovies I described, or even mosquitoes following a rainstorm, have a very unstable population growth that looks like this. Lots of peaks and valleys. These peaks are known as overshoot, and then the valleys are known as a crash. And so that happens in your R-select species. But again, what their strategy is just to reproduce as quickly as possible. Their population may crash, but they can repopulate very, very quickly. Whereas the strategy for a K-selected species is to try to maintain stability right around the carrying capacity. This helps us to understand why some species become invasive. And these are plants or animals, even diseases that are alien or non-native to certain ecosystems. And this happens as a result of globalization in human populations. Our movement around the planet has us either purposely or without awareness transferring species from one area of the planet to the other. So the lionfish is a great example, and this map here is actually an animation of where of the explosion of the lionfish population. It was introduced to the Bay of Biscayne in Miami, basically as pet owners were releasing them. They didn't want to keep them. There are some theories that maybe came from the Miami Seaquarium during Hurricane Andrew, but it seems it was prior to Hurricane Andrew. And you can see the population is exploded. There's the reason that the lionfish is taking over, and here's their population growth curve. The reason that it's exploded like this is because this is an Indo-Pacific Ocean species, not supposed to be in Atlantic, so there's no natural predators over here. At least there wasn't at first. Some species are learning to control them, and so we're hoping that helps to control their population a little bit. But they've been taking over and out-competing native species, so we call them invasive, which again it's like they're invading, and they've really taken over the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and as far north as New York and Boston, I believe, in the east coast of the United States. So it's quite a problem for fisheries management and things of that sort. Fish aren't the only example. Plants can also take over. Kudzu is a very popular invasive species, and this was actually purposely introduced in the late 1800s as an ornamental plant, and also because it grew so quickly as to help control erosion. But this doesn't have any natural grazers, and so it just was taking over. And you can see the southeast United States is where we see this kudzu vine is growing over existing vegetation, really taking over, and it's quite a problem in the southeast United States. So this can damage crops, it can smother our native vegetation, and can really be quite a nuisance, and has to be controlled through measures from the government. So that costs taxpayers money for putting herbicides and harvesting these things off of crops and stuff, and also even national monuments. It can grow everywhere. So it's really a bit of a stressor for ecosystems, and so these are what we call invasive species. We'll talk more about these later in the course when we look at things that are truly like global problems, and this is one of the major global problems is invasive species. But you can see these invasive species grow because they tend to be R-selected, so very, very fast population growth, and they kind of remain unchecked to a certain extent. A little bit of AP practice. We'll start with the MCQ. So take a moment to answer this question here. So the diagram that you are given, it says the diagram above illustrates the number of individuals in a population changed with time as a result of external stresses and resource limitation. Which lettered portion of the curve most likely corresponds to the carrying capacity of the system? So hopefully you selected E. Right? So we can see, remember, A would be the lag phase, B is the exponential growth or the full biotic potential, right? C, we've got a little bit of overshoot, and D, the population is declining, and E is where we have reached that carrying capacity. Here is the FRQ, so go ahead and pause and take a moment to answer this question. Okay, so this example is of termites. So they're described here as social insects that are essential decomposers in tropical rainforest ecosystems. Termites may account for up to 95% of insect biomass in tropical rainforests. Termites can consume vast amounts of dead and decomposing plant material thanks to the work of mutualistic cellulose-digesting microorganisms that inhabit their guts. In addition to their roles as important decomposers, termites digest plant materials and directly contribute to carbon dioxide and methane emissions into the atmosphere. It is likely that, like many insect species, termites and their symbionts may be sensitive to changes in their microclimate, caused by global climate change, especially with regard to temperature and humidity. Part A. Respond to the following using the data in the table above, which gives the rate of wood consumption by termites in milligrams per day per termite under various temperature and relative humidity conditions. Under optimal conditions, the emission rate of methane by termites is approximately 70 kilograms of methane per 1,000 per year per 1,000 termites. So part A, according to the data, what are the optimal temperature and relative humidity for termite activity? And so here is the correct answer to part 1, right? It would be 90% humidity and 30% or 30 degrees Celsius. So that's, again, this is the highest amount of activity in the chart. So that's the correct answer. Now part 2, given a density of 4.5 times 10 to the 7th, a little bit of scientific notation, but again, all you have to do is move the decimal point here 7 places if you wanted to the right, if you wanted to make this, if you aren't familiar with scientific notation. But basically, that's the number of termites per hectare, and optimal conditions, which are mentioned up here, calculate the annual amount of methane emitted in kilograms by termites in a 2,000 hectare tropical forest. So a little bit of math here. You may have been thrown off, like, why are we doing math here? I'm just kind of throwing this in as an example. They can put math in any kind of FRQ, whether it's looking at population growth or climate change. So this is a 2-point question, right? 1 point earned for the correct setup and 1 point earned for the answer. So the setup looks like this. So you'd start out with 2,000 hectares. And for these math problems, that's what we want to basically have a starting point. The end point is what they ask us to calculate. And what they are asking us to calculate is to calculate the annual amount of methane in kilograms per year, right? And so that's why we have that as our answer. So we start out with 2,000 hectares. We know that for every hectare, there are 4.5 times 10 to the 7th termites. We're given that as a conversion factor. We also know that for every 1,000 termites, they produce 70 kilograms of methane per year. That was given for us up here. And so now it just basically becomes a multiplication and division problem, right? So we can cross out termites here. You can cross out hectares. You're left with kilograms of methane per year, which is what we want in our answer. So it would be 2,000 times 4.5 times 10 to the 7th times 70 divided by 1,000, you should get 6.3 times 10 to the 9th. And again, you could write out this as like a whole long number if you wanted to, if you're not very comfortable with scientific notation. We'll do plenty more examples of this so you can see how it works. Now, part 3 is a similar question. Suppose the temperature increases 35 degrees and the relativity is 50%. Using the data provided, determine the amount of methane in kilograms that would be emitted by the termites in a 2,000. So notice we change things up here a little bit. All right, so we are basically going to change the amount of, we're going from 0.27 is the maximum rate, but we increased it, what we say we increased it to 50% or decreased it to 50% humidity and 35 degrees Celsius. So that takes us to a rate of 0.9. And so now you're basically doing a ratio here, 0.9 over 2.27 times that maximum rate. And so that's what would happen. There would be fewer kilograms of methane released each year if we did not operate in optimal conditions. Now, part 4 is to explain why the population size of termites is also affected by temperature and humidity. So now this is kind of the conceptual application to the lecture that we just had, right? So this is a 2-point question as well, a point earned for the reason and 1 point for the linked explanation. So reason, temperature and humidity are limiting factors for termite populations and their symbionts, or there is a range of tolerance for temperature and humidity values, right? So we talked about that in an earlier lecture. The explanation is, well, the temperature of 40 degrees, all termite wood consumption ceases. And at 20 degrees Celsius, the activity is the lowest regardless of humidity levels, right? So temperature has an impact on the rate. These are the explanations. Another potential reason is that termites reproduce less when conditions are not optimal, right? And so they swarm less when fewer new colonies are established. Third reason, temperature and humidity are limiting factors for plant growth. So therefore, with fewer plants available, well, there's less habitat for the termites to consume and take hold of. Now, part B, it has been observed that soon after a tropical rainforest is cleared, termite density increases to an estimated 6.8 times 10 to the 7th termites per hectare. Thereafter, the termite population size decreases dramatically. What is the most likely reason that the density of termites increases when a tropical rainforest is cleared? So here we go. There's a couple. One point for the most likely reason. The forest is clear. There's substantial increase in dead plant material, or the food source for the termites has dramatically increased and supports a larger populations, right? So there's a lot of decomposing wood, so termites love that. Part 2, why do the termite populations eventually decrease? Well, again, 1 point can be earned for one of the following descriptions. The termites exhaust their food supply and die off. The termite population exceeds the carrying capacity of the forest and the population crashes. With no trees, the surface temperature increase and may exceed the upper temperature limit at which termites can survive, and there is competition for a limited resource. So all of those are limiting factors and apply to what we just discussed in this lecture. So hopefully, if you didn't get those concepts, and this is a complicated free response question. So if you're intimidated, that's fine. You'll eventually come to be more comfortable answering questions like this. But hopefully you now understand how what the principles we learned in this lecture apply to completing this type of FRQ.